Good morning. That was the most extraordinary presentation I've been through. I mean, my father had been very proud, and my mother had believed it. I am going to speak English because my Icelandic is still in development. And I would like to start with, Nordea is today one of the 10 leading banks in Europe. 80% of the business is outside Sweden in 15 different countries. We have a market value on the stock exchange in Stockholm of around 300 billion Swedish crowns. We have a balance sheet that is big. For some people it might be too big, 600 billion euros. We have had a stable profit level of roughly 30 billion Swedish crowns for many years. 11 million customers, 33,000 employees. It has not always been like that. And I will take you through the development of the early 90s. If that can be of any inspiration to Iceland, that's up to you. We could see already in 1990 in Sweden that we had indications that the crisis was on its way. Deep troubles in the financial companies like Nyckel and Gammelstaden was predicting something is on its way. In 91, credit losses amounted to record heights, and to a great extent, the losses came from real estate. Looking back on this, in essence, it was a political crisis that had been built up by all our Swedes over the 15, 20 years. The nation had been allowed to live above its assets. It is as simple as that. And it turned out to be three different but interconnected crises. There was a structural crisis. We had the highest sickness leave in Europe, in spite of the fact that Sweden is one of the healthiest countries in the world. We had the highest wages per worked hour in OECD, and that meant that we lacked competitive capacity and ability. In addition to the structural crisis, we had an economic crisis. We had high inflation. And we had a huge budget deficit with high international borrowing that in itself created high interest rates. And for the third, we had a real estate banking crisis. The background was that a wave of deregulation led to credit expansion. And the banks got crazy, I would say, fighting for market shares. And there was also a very dangerous situation in deregulation of the currencies, where many Swedes took loans outside Sweden in other currencies because of lower interest rates. There was also inflation led to a flight to real assets. Inflation destroyed assets, so the flight to real assets was quite natural at the beginning. And it led to investments in real estate. This speculation in real estate led, at the end of the day, to a casino economy based on the assumption that the last idiot wasn't born. That is, the houses, the real estate, you did not buy them in order to have a rent that paid for costs and for the borrowing costs. You bought a house in order to sell it to someone prepared to pay more. This was accelerated by the fact that we had finance companies that took the top loans The banks took 70% maybe of a real estate building, and the financial companies took 30% or more. The reason, and they were financed by the banks because the capital need for the banks was 8%, while for the finance company only 1.6%, because they were under the supervision of the FSA, the supervisory authority. That turned out to be a fallacy. Then doubts emerged on future development. Maybe prices are not going up anymore, and people wanted to sell. And you got a sale pressure that created a panic, that created a crash. And one big reason was, of course, bad credit analysis on the bank side. So the banks were in deep crisis, and the country was in deep crisis. And the whole thing was homemade. We couldn't blame anyone apart from ourselves. We had then to get the house in order. And we had a conservative government in those days. But the politicians, government and the opposition, decided that they should not fight each other on the financial crisis. They should solve it together and not make any points out of on these crises. And I think that was one of the most important keys that Sweden could get together in a crisis situation and say, let's fight on other things, but on the financial crisis. If we now go to Nordbanken, the bank where I joined, I came in January 91, and I can tell you the bank was badly hurt. I would say almost in bankruptcy. And the reason I went there was sheer curiosity or looking for some adventures. I did not know how adventurous it was to be. It was owned to 78% by the government, and the rest was on the market. And I had two important tasks. One was to get the vehicle back on the road, that is to get the balance sheet that functioned. And the other was to stimulate and motivate people to get out of the beds and go to the bank and work. In those days, it was more decent to tell people that you were playing piano in a pornographic film instead of saying that you were a banker. So, I mean, we had to start over with everything. And we created a prudent credit process. We educated in the bank at least 1,000 people on a new credit education that was so good that even the FSA wanted to have the course. And we worked very hard on attitudes. Don't do business where you hesitate. Be very far away from the gray areas. And it worked. Financial reporting systems had to be improved. You had to work on to get an administration that was impeccable. And we had to promote law and order. A function like internal audit that normally has not very glamorous signs around, they was lifted up. And we also had to make a product market focusing, that is focusing on the retail business, the Swedish companies and the Swedish citizens. Back to basics, and it should be a secure industry. We had a compensation programs that promoted prudence. And there was, of course, a number of external activities in order to get back the confidence and trust from the public. I was sitting in the television talking about the bank, coming into the private rooms in every house where the television set. Very, very awkward for me, but I learned how it is to be public in those days. But it's also important to distance yourself from the past. You have to say that's history. Otherwise, you're running a risk to have guilt by association, and it's unfair. But it's very easy that it happens in the media drama that we are living in. We thought we did a good job, but it was not good enough. It worsened, and in '92 was a very dark year in Sweden. So I was sitting with my colleague and said, all these bad credits, we cannot go on, he said, if we don't get it out of the balance sheet. In Pittsburgh, in the US, we had learned about a bank called Mellon Bank that had divided the bank in a good bank and a bad bank, and a workout company. So we went to the government and said, you have to buy 100% of the bank. Make the bank 100% state-owned. That was, for many people, a very difficult step. And then you can divide the bank in the running bank and in the workout company that we called Securum. And you have to finance the companies. I admire the politicians that took a quick decision on that. They took a fast decision in Parliament in June '92, and there were very tough preconditions. The ribs should be seen on the bank, and I had to go through a cost cutting of roughly 20-25% of the operation. Other banks were in the same trouble, and in the autumn of '92, the government issued a guarantee that the Swedish banks were going to pay their debts. This guarantee was never used, but it was very useful. So after that, in '93, Nordbanken was profitable. We merged with another Swedish bank, and then you have the story, we merged with the Finnish bank Merita. We merged or acquired the Danish bank Uni Denmark, and also merged and acquired Kreditkassen in Norway, and created a Nordic bank out of that. And the reason we wanted to be big was that the Swedish and Nordic companies had become extremely demanding on credits and support. We could build up an international network for our big clients. From an asset management point of view, it was quite useful. And when it came to IT management, we got the confidence and the muscles to develop the IT systems as we wanted to have them. This is not relevant for today, but it's just to see what I skip all that process, because I think what is more relevant is what's happening in 2008. Then we had a new crisis. This time it was not homemade, it was global. And it's only 2 days ahead on Sunday. It's 5 years since Lehman Brothers went bust. And we still have an international debt crisis, particularly in Europe. It started, as I understand it, by imbalances in the American economy. Huge budget deficits. George Bush has started 2 wars that were unfinanced, not financed. But they could borrow cheaply from China, and they had very, very low interest rates. The political decision was also by Bill Clinton and later on by Bush that everybody could afford a house, and thereby was created the subprime loans that you could get them through the banks, but also particularly Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the 2 lending company, government companies. Then it was invented on Wall Street how you can get these loans out of the balance sheet of the banks by taking the loans out and repack them. So start with cut them in small pieces, reshuffle that, and add own equity. And then you insured the package, and you had a bond that you could sell everywhere in the world. It got, because of the insurance and of the own capital, it got AAA rating. But the crazy thing is that someone believed, and not someone, many believed that if you have a risk and put it in small pieces, the risk disappears. But it's still there. And it turned out that it was there. So the bubble burst, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. But Lehman Brothers had a balance sheet full of these loans. So they believed in it as well. I mean, one thing is being immoral and criminal. The other is to be stupid. I think they were more stupid than criminal. And I met in 2007 the chairman of Citibank in Cape Town. And I said, why do we have so much subprime loans on your books? And he answered, Hans, as long as the music is playing, we will go on dancing. And I said, dance close to the exit. Well, as we all know, the consequence of that, we got enormous big funding problems for the banks in the autumn of 2008. And the politicians said, never more. The problem for politicians is that they have only one or maybe two instruments. One is propaganda, of course, and the other is legislation. And the problem sometimes that you cannot regulate welfare. You cannot, but that's the only thing. So sometimes regulation is there to, well, it cannot really reach its goals. The interesting thing now in this situation was that looking at our bank, Nordea was a different bank. We could, you could not see from our quarterly results that there was a big crisis out there. We had learned. From the crisis of beginning of 90s, we had learned a lesson. There's an enormous big budget crisis in Europe, but Sweden is one of the best in class. We had, as a country, learned from the past. So then, can we draw any conclusions out of this? On the political arena, one is, if you look at the owners, shareholders should take all the losses before government steps in. That is obvious. The creation of a workout company makes it possible to concentrate on normal business and to get expertise on workout processes. It was very helpful to have a coalition government on the financial crisis. It was a problem for all parties. It was necessary, and that's going on, to strengthen the capital adequacy rules. I have absolutely nothing to say about that. And you have also to channel in a good way the public wrath. People are angry, and one has to let the public be angry and to handle it. Stronger instruments to the supervisory authorities. But it's important not to avoid populism. We should not have rules that's just to silence opposition. The rules should be there to create a good system. In Sweden, I would say, after 91, the government got back all the money, I would say almost 3 times what they invested in the process. On ownership factors, I repeat here, taxpayers should be fully compensated before shareholders get anything. I would say at the end of the day, if possible, privatize. It's not very good to have roles mixed up in the government. Owner, if you have the player and the referee on the same match, It's very complicated. But you have to await a stable situation. If you look at the regulatory framework, we had Parliament decisions on Securum, the workout company. That was very important. We created something called the Bank Support Authority that handled all the problems in the banking society. And we had rules on capital adequacy. And there we had, it's mostly around markets, trading with different, more complicated instruments, I would say. I've got a question from the chamber. What would you say would be the key success factors for Nordbanken? In the phase one, I would say we focused on balance sheet and on processes. We focused on products, limited ourselves to the trade that was important, particularly the retail. We educated people. We were key going on. We never satisfied with the level of knowledge. And we worked hard on good order. When I was traveling, I went and came to a branch office. I always came in through the back door. And if I could see the shoes in order and the clothes in order, I knew that there was also better order in those branch offices in the papers than not only in the back door. This created, of course, a myth. People were calling, he's coming, okay, we have to have a good order with the shoes. It's also important to have improved financial reporting. If you cannot trust the numbers, you get very nervous. And we also work very hard on the ethical questions. Ethics is a very difficult word. Normally, ethics take on where the rules are ending, so to say. So you need to have this internal compass to find out where you would like to be. And we have no real answers to that, but I would say you have to work on the questions. We had different case studies and in groups in the banks, and they said, work on this. They came up with different answers. But the most important is we opened the eyes for people to think about it. The business model was very simple. It should be humble, focused, retail. We lowered the risk profile, but more important than lowering risk profile is to analyze the risk and price it correctly. And I would say to anyone that get the house in order before any new structural changes. Mergers, acquisitions can only be done if there are very strong internal systems. And give compensation for good order to the employees. Phase one has to do with our growth in Nordic. I would like to end saying culture. Culture is something that is so important. That is the distillate of everything we are doing and saying, and that is more important than any rules in the world. If they are strong, that you do the right things, and we don't mix up things, and etc., etc. Key factors going forward for us is good, prudent government decisions create a healthy macroeconomic environment. Politicians have a tendency to point at the banks or the financial area, but they create the macroeconomic precondition. The fact that Nordea is doing fine in Sweden is not only because of Nordea, it's because politicians are doing a good job to create a good macroeconomic environment. You should learn from the lessons past, but don't live in the past. To go through all these photo albums doesn't help very much. Going forward is always the name of the game. And the last conclusion is, don't deal with matters that are beyond your brain. Don't deal with matters that are beyond the capacity of your brain, because that's where the whole thing starts. Thank you very much.
much, Hans. He has kindly agreed to take 2 to 3 questions.
Okay.
So I will open up the floor for questions, but first I'd like to take the liberty of asking one question. Now we have among ourselves, we have Minister of Finance, we have the authorities from FSA and the central bank. What would be your advice to them as creating the right environment for the banks in going forward? So what would be the fundamental things that you would mention to a good advice to them, since we have them in the audience?
Honestly, I'm humble enough not to come here to tell the so important people how to deal with these things. I think they do it very well for themselves. But we all have a common idea that it has to be prudent. We have to understand our roles. The financial industry is very much a service industry to the economy as a whole, and when it comes to regulation, don't regulate things that is not necessary to regulate. Create a regulation that creates companies that also can create growth and welfare. And so there is always a risk, particularly in European Union today, that some politicians think they can regulate everything into welfare. But companies have to have some form of freedom to move around and develop themselves. But work on attitudes, culture, I would say. But as I said, you do that much better than I can.
So questions from the audience, if any? There are some microphones around, I understand.
There we have
yes,
two.
Please.
Well, thank you very much for a nice talk. I'm Ragnar Arnarsson from the University of Iceland. I have a slightly flippant question. I noticed that Nordea had merged with other banks in the 90s. Would Nordea be interested in buying an Icelandic bank?
I'm so old, so my hearing is not the best.
So the question is whether you would be interested in buying an Icelandic bank.
That is one of the few questions that I couldn't answer.
So we already have sales pitch here.
At this stage, I'm the honorary chairman. I have absolutely nothing to tell.
Any more questions? Then maybe I'll use my authority again. You mentioned that it would be very interesting to take a distance from the past.
Yes.
And also it would be very interesting, or it is very interesting, to focus on the culture. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, in particular in taking this distance from the past? What does that mean, and how did you do that, and how did that help you? Well,
in dealing with this, you have to talk about the future. You have to talk about how to do it. We should not forget the past, because the past is giving us a fantastic platform for development to understand. We can do that, but we should absolutely not do that. But you should not, if you were not involved, it's very different. You shouldn't be there to stand up and take the discussion with the environment on the past, because you get involved in questions that you are not really committed to, and you don't want to talk about. It's a difficult game, because you are sometimes pushed into it. But I mean, I can see these guys sitting here.
And the culture also, and the culture you mentioned that was very important.
So the culture is something that you have to work on over and over again. Very much of culture is in building a strong internal audit, to have a reporting system that is absolutely you can trust it all the time. But also talk about what is our task, what are we aiming for. A good, very much is a question of leadership. And people ask me, what is a good leader? And looking over in the world, I would say 3 items that are the most important for a good leader. That is integrity. Integrity is a very nice word, but very hard to live up to. Integrity is when your viewpoints and your thinking is not corrupt. If you look at people like business managers or politicians for that matter, they talk in a way which I would call the analytical language. And there is another language called a negotiating language. Sometimes we can hear politicians and we hear business people talking in the analytical way. But as a matter of fact, they are negotiating with us as a reader of the paper or looking at the television. So it's very important that you focus on integrity. The other is courage. People are very impressed and want to follow people that have courage. And the reason for that is courage is quite a scarce resource. And the third is having a vision and an idea of the future and being able to translate that into normal language. And we are aiming for that. That can be the small department, it can be the big group, but still create a goal that is reasonably reachable and understood by everybody. These things can create a culture. Everything boils down to one simple word in all leadership, and that is hope. The mankind is driven forward by dreams, expectations, ambitions, hope. And leadership is very much of creating hope.
Thank you very much, Hans Dalborg, for being with us. It's been an honor to have you.